Hi, my name is Niina and you're listening Together Through the Storms podcast. Welcome to the journey with me. I would like to begin by acknowledging traditional owners of the land where I'm recording this episode today, which is the Wurrung country. I would like to pay my respects to the elders past and present and to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening today. Hi, and thanks for tuning in on Together Through the Storms podcast. My name is Niina, and today's episode will be discussing a topic that is quite significant for all parents who have child or children with additional needs or disabilities. So I will be talking about grief. I will be sharing a voice of other parents on this journey as well as my own experiences. But before we get into today's episode, I just want to remind you of my free guide, Communication Tips for Connecting with Your Child. If you would like some practical tips on how to engage with your child and communicate in alternative ways, this guide is perfect for you. To access it, all you have to do is join my community. You can find the link either from this episode description or from my Instagram bio. You will then also receive a fortnightly community letter full of tips on how to navigate life with child or children with additional needs. I look forward to connecting with you. But now let's go into the episode. It's time to start with a quote. Today, the quote goes like this. Grief is like the ocean. It comes on waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm, and sometimes it's overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. I feel like this is a perfect way of explaining grief. If I would have to describe grief with one word, it would be waves. At least that's my own experience. And that's probably one of the reasons why I also named my podcast Together Through the Storms. So I feel like there are bigger and smaller storms that we come across on our journey, and they come and go. And it's all about finding the people who will actually see you, acknowledge the storms you are going through, and also catch you when the storms feel too heavy. Something that really helps me when I'm in the middle of a big wave is a mantra. This too shall pass. No matter how stuck I might feel in that moment, I remind myself that this will pass. I will get through this. Although in that moment it might feel impossible, but it will happen. And the more experience you have around riding the waves and going through those waves of grief, the more you learn to trust that it actually will pass. Now, after hearing the quote and getting a little bit deeper into the concept of grief, if you have an opportunity to close your eyes for 2 seconds, please do so. Try to come back to your body and try to identify, where do you feel grief? Where does grief live in your body? There might be an easy and quick answer for that, and you might already know. Maybe it's in your chest, in your tummy, in your heart, or maybe you don't quite know, or maybe it changes. Just making those connections of how does the grief feel physically in your body can sometimes feel a very powerful way to approach grief and also release it. When we talk about grief, I think one thing that is really important to remember is that grief doesn't come from a place of not loving your child unconditionally. Grief doesn't mean that you would wish that your child would be somehow different or you don't accept the situation. Grief is just an inevitable part of the journey. And I personally feel like acknowledging it, recognizing it, and sometimes embracing it makes it easier to navigate the journey with the grief. The more we resist it, the more power it has over us. Whereas sometimes acknowledging it, paying attention to it may actually make it smaller and more manageable. On one of my previous episodes, I talked about initial diagnosis and all the emotions that I experienced during that time with my own girls. And grief was such a huge part of that process. But then I've heard people say and think that grief is only related to the initial diagnosis part, and then eventually you accept the grief and the new circumstances and you overcome the grief. I wish it would be that simple, but at least for me personally, that hasn't been the case. Yes, after the initial shock and the initial diagnosis stage, grief changes and it becomes part of you, but you will never truly lose grief. Grief feels like uninvited guest that joined you for the journey and is there to stay. Like referred in the quote, grief ebbs and flows. Sometimes the grief is almost invisible, yet you still know it's there. Other times it's screaming at your face and there's no way hiding from it. I often feel like you're grieving for the moments that you imagine that would look so different. We grieve for what we expected that life without children would be like, yet it may have turned into something completely different. Do you remember the poem Welcome to Holland that I referred to on my first episode? We've landed somewhere completely different as where we expect it to be, and as much as we will find acceptance and learn to navigate life in Holland, there are still moments when it hurts. What I've also noticed is that grief shows up in the most unexpected situations, and that's what makes it so hard because it's so unpredictable. It can really get to you when you're off guard. The intensity of grief varies significantly, but in those moments, I personally feel like my heart is physically aching. What I would also like to highlight is that most of the time, grief is invisible for others. Often, we won't be able to recognize other people's grief, yet it can be still so heavy to carry. So be kind and reach out when you can. I asked from you, what does grief look like to you? And I got some really powerful answers. They were very heavy to read and they were also incredibly raw. I asked for permission to share some of these with you because I think these demonstrate so well how silent the grief can look like and how heavy things we may be processing internally without anyone even actually knowing. One person shared that she's experiencing grief around not being enough. And I think we can all relate to that feeling. And that is something that is present very often in our lives, especially as parents to child or children with additional needs or disabilities. We juggle so many different roles. The workload is never ending. And in the middle of that, you may feel like you're not fulfilling any of the roles the way you would like to. But I feel like this is such a hard topic because we can give reassurance and comfort to perhaps our friends who are going through similar situation, but we can be so much harder on ourselves. So it's also very important to remember to be kind to yourself, to reassure yourself that you are doing enough in all of those roles with all the juggling. Another cause of grief is trying to juggle between work and family life balance when your child has high needs and your employer is not understanding or being flexible, but instead putting pressure on you. I can imagine lots and lots of people would be experiencing the same grief around work and family life balance. And it kind of goes back to the previous topic about feeling grief around not being enough. The next grief is quite heavy. I'm experiencing grief around sending my twin boys into different schools, one to mainstream and one to a special school, and not being able to be there for them both on their first day, but instead having to choose which child's school to attend. Feels like an impossible dilemma where you feel like you're forced to choose one of the children. It's also sad to know that there will be lots of these situations in the future and you simply can't be there for them both. The next one is related a little bit to the initial diagnosis stage. When my baby was diagnosed with epilepsy, I experienced grief thinking all the things he would miss out on and would not be able to do in the future. At the same time, I knew there was no point grieving so far ahead, but in that moment, those emotions just came to me. We didn't know at the time how he would develop, and now, having a formal diagnosis, it is obvious that there will be lots of things he won't be able to do, and that causes grief. But at the same time, I feel happy that he has developed in many areas and can live a full life just with his own twist. I just love the positivity that comes through that message. I feel like grief blends in with all the other emotions. At the same time, there can be a level of grief and a level of joy or happiness existing at the same time. The next one is also quite powerful. One thing that makes me experience grief is the way people pity towards disabled people. People can't seem to be able to see behind it that disabled person can live a good life, and how much good my child's disability has brought into our lives. I really feel the next one. I experience grief about how other people don't seem to understand how exhausting life with a child with disabilities is, and how much more we have to work for so many things. I don't know if you feel the heaviness of that one, but I definitely do. Probably the heaviest grief is this thought that I have. I just wish I could live a day longer than my own special child so that I could be there to look after him, protect him, and to ensure he is okay all the way until the end. Luckily, he has 3 beautiful siblings who look after him and care for him too. I feel like that just makes me speechless. I don't know if there can be any more profound level of grief than that. My 8-year-old daughter asked me who's going to look after my son with disabilities once we, the parents, die. I felt heartbroken. It was really hard to respond to that so that she doesn't already at her age feel heavy burden of being obligated to look after his brother when we as parents are no longer here. They already care and do so much for him. I just want to send all my love to this person and anyone going through these emotions. Another level of grief that I learned not so long ago was something called anticipatory grief. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Grieving for something that hasn't yet been lost, but you know it will. Perhaps your child has been diagnosed with something that will progressively get worse over time. I think it's good to be mindful of that level of grief, although you might not be experiencing it yourself with your child, but that there are families who are dealing with this level of grief every single day. I guess the question is, how do you learn to recognize and understand grief, and how can you find peace with grief? I wish I had some very wise answers for you, but instead I can only speak from my own experience. You probably already have developed some very good coping strategies, how to manage grief, and everyone is different. You have to find ways that work for you. I feel like for me, the most important thing has been to recognize and acknowledge the grief. Because once I do recognize and understand that I'm experiencing grief, it makes it easier to navigate through it. But I'm not going to lie, sometimes I feel like all I can do is cry it out. The heaviness of the wave may feel so profound that it nearly paralyzes you. I have also talked a lot about the importance of the community, your tribe, your people. The best way for me to ride the wave of grief is to share my feelings with a person who really understands. Have someone to talk to who sees you and understands you. That's so game changing. In a very strange way, during my journey as a parent for children with additional needs, grief has somehow become part of me. It's almost impossible to separate it from who I am. Planning this episode really challenged me to identify the moments of grief that I experience on daily level. And I realized how often those feelings arise. And it's just such a profound part of me and interaction with other people. Sometimes grief feels like a little pinch in the middle of conversation with another mom, for example. And you can acknowledge it, but just carry on without getting too emotionally caught up with it. Whereas other times, it's that huge wave that tries to drown you. Like with any emotion, sometimes all you need to do is acknowledge it, sit with it, and try to release it. I feel very lucky because for me, grief is rarely paralyzing anymore. It's more like in the quote I shared at the start, I have learned to swim with it. I just still really want to highlight the fact that experiencing grief does not mean that you would wish your child would be somehow different or anything else than they are, or you would not love or accept your child wholeheartedly. I really think that both can exist at the same time, profound love and acceptance, as well as waves of grief. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode about grief. I hope this episode gave you perhaps some new perspective on grief. Let's just remember that lots of the grief that we experience is often invisible for others, and kindness goes a long way. Also, remember to be kind to yourself, especially on those days when you feel like grief is a massive wave. Just remember, breathe, this too shall pass. If you know someone who would really need to hear this episode, share this with a friend. I would also love to invite you to join my community. You will access my free guide with some practical communication tips, and you will receive my fortnightly community letter full of practical tips when navigating everyday life with child or children with additional needs. I look forward to seeing you back here next week. Take care, everyone. Sending much love.